Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Alice Lee, and I will be moderating the last panel of our event titled, How Immigrants Can Stand Up to the War Agenda. In the earlier part of the day, our speakers shared the histories of the ordinary men and women of Korea, Vietnam, and Afro-America against the US ruling elite. Facing countless tragedy and difficult odds, these ordinary men and women dedicated their lives so that their children and their children's children could live in peace and dignity. Out of these struggles emerged great leaders, ideological clarity, and a common destiny for all of humanity. However, in the US and in Philadelphia, there are many immigrants that come from oppressed peoples with histories of struggle who do not see the Black freedom movement or anti-colonial struggles. Instead, they are put against African Americans and the people they come from in Asia, Africa, and Latin America. Our speakers in this panel will examine how those in power in the US have veiled the shared inheritances and tools for true unity and democracy and replaced it with false enemies and false achievements to promote a war agenda. In doing so, our speakers offer us the tools to transform into people with courage and consciousness and fight for peace in Philadelphia and the world. Our first speaker, Brandon Doe, is a member of Viet Lao Khmer and the Saturday Free School for Philosophy and Black Liberation. He will clarify the assumptions of the refugee movement and explore the makings of a new Asian American. Our second speaker, Eddie Barraza, is a member of the Bandung Reading Group and the Saturday Free School for Philosophy and Black Liberation. He will speak on how the migrant movement obscures what the US ruling elite has done to Latin America and is used as a tool to sow disunity among the working class. He will also redefine relations between Latinos and Asians towards a shared future. And our third and last speaker, Eunnuri, is a member of the Saturday Free School for Philosophy and Black Liberation and the Bandung Reading Group. She works as a lab manager at the University of Pennsylvania. She'll uncover the role of South Korea and its culture in our times and call to our responsibility towards peace, democracy, and reunification. Each speaker will speak for about 15 to 20 minutes, and depending on how much time we have left, we'll have a Q&A. With that, we start with our first speaker, Brandon Doe.
Thank you, Alice. I would like to thank everyone. Yes. I would like to extend a thank you to everyone in attendance today, the venue of the Asian Arts Initiative, and our fellow panelists for being able to make it out here today. I wanted to start with the statement that in order to know ourselves, we must know our enemy. We must know the enemy who teaches us that we are separate from the world and instill ourselves with an education that teaches us that we are a part of the world. With this education, we can pick up an idea or a life mission that is worthy of committing our lives to, as my brother Gregory said. I want the young people in the audience to know today, especially, that your dignity is worth fighting for. Your value, your humanity as a person is worth fighting for. In order to see the future and have a vision for the future that you want, that you can fight for, we need education, because education is the best form of self-defense, and also education is our best instrument in making a new future. I wanted to talk about the situation of the refugees, and specifically it's about Vietnamese refugees, but I believe that it is something that is relatable to everybody in this room today in understanding the machinations of the system that puts you against your own interests. In 1975, the revolutionary forces of Vietnam, with the support of the Vietnamese people and the progressive peoples of the world, defeated the US-backed Saigon regime. Following the humiliating defeat of the United States, thousands of Vietnamese fled the country, landing in refugee camps throughout Asia and North America. This moment in history marked the beginning of the Vietnamese American, whose worldview significantly differed with the worldview of the people from which they came. Young Vietnamese Americans are instilled with the belief that we became a righteous and dignified people only once our families made their journey toward North America. American propaganda on the Vietnam War and the stigma of being the descendants of refugees has dictated our trajectory in Western civilization. Although the refugee experience is not all there is to our history, the refugee identity remains a driving force behind the standard by which Vietnamese Americans live their lives. In order to maintain their safety and social status, Vietnamese Americans are pressured to remain silent about the war crimes that the United States committed against the people of Vietnam. On the other hand, they are encouraged to use false claims to criticize the Socialist Republic of Vietnam and the forces that liberated Vietnam from imperialism. The majority of Vietnamese Americans consent to the position that the American war in Vietnam was necessary to free the Vietnamese people from communism. This consent, however, was manufactured by the US government, who for generations waged ideological warfare against the Vietnamese people. The US government set their sights on turning Vietnamese Americans against the progressive forces of America and the world. In doing so, the imperialists produced a people who reinforced the lie that America's genocidal wars against Asian nations are being waged to save darker people from their own moral corruption. Today, I would like to ask the question, what is the purpose of imposing the refugee identity onto Vietnamese Americans? How does this identity make us see ourselves and our role in society? I would like to spark a conversation about who we are, how we got here, and where we have the potential to go if we are willing to make the right choices. A defining factor of the Vietnamese refugee experience post-1975 was that the power to determine the destiny of the refugees laid not within the hands of the Vietnamese refugees, but in the hands of American camp officials who strictly limited and controlled their freedom to express their culture, political viewpoints, and customs. The written observations of scholars who visited these camps in 1975 foreshadowed the present condition of Vietnamese Americans. They wrote, "The Vietnamese role in the refugee camps was passive. Things were done to them. They did very little. And like much of the camp life that followed, they stood in interminable lines waiting for something to happen. This mental state of helplessness resembles that of a billiard ball, devoid of inner self-propelling force, allows its path and movement to be governed by forces beyond its control." The Vietnamese were robbed of their personal agency. The Vietnamese language itself was banned in specific areas of the camps. Teachers were sent to indoctrinate them into a white middle-class worldview. They condescendingly lectured Vietnamese on the correct way to carry themselves, to pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States despite what the US military just inflicted onto their people, and to fear the establishment. Many refugees languished for months and even years in these conditions. These conditions created a self-destructive or a destructive self-fulfilling prophecy, and as a consequence, many refugees fell into drug addiction, domestic abuse, and alcoholism. The imperialists began indoctrinating Vietnamese people decades prior to the post-war refugee crisis that we most commonly hear about today. The United States Information Agency specialized in waging psychological warfare to destroy the liberation movements of Asia and Africa. Founded in 1953 with the backing of the US State Department, they had a headquarters in South Vietnam and aimed to manipulate the masses of Vietnamese against one another. To strengthen and expand imperialist domination over the country of Vietnam, they made the Vietnamese people believe that the United States way of governing was the best model of freedom and democracy. Ultimately, they aimed to turn the whole of Vietnam into a base of imperialism by which they could organize against the liberation movements rising in Asia. The USIA spread their disinformation through newspapers, magazines, films, and more. They opened institutions such as libraries, radio stations, and movie theaters. They employed Vietnamese talent to be the face of their operation through a front called the Vietnamese Information Service to hide their role in propagandizing the people. In 1954, 1 million Vietnamese Catholics fled from Ho Chi Minh's North Vietnam to the US-occupied South Vietnam. This happened shortly after Ho Chi Minh's army defeated the French in the Battle of Dien Bien Phu and the partitioning of Vietnam into North and South. The mass exodus in 1954 was a CIA-manufactured crisis through what US intelligence called Operation Passage to Freedom. It was a scheme to destroy the anti-Western unity that Ho Chi Minh and the Vietnamese people built by telling Vietnamese Catholics the egregious lie that South Vietnam was safer for Catholics than North Vietnam. In the midst of the 1954 refugee crisis, the USA published a pamphlet about the refugees titled "Flight to Freedom: A Story of Courage, Sacrifice, and Faith in the Free World." This pamphlet praised the refugees victimized by US propaganda while vilifying Ho Chi Minh's Viet Minh Army, who were the ones standing up to the US imperialists. The pamphlet praised the refugees for leaving the North and running toward the quote-unquote safety of South Vietnam, portraying the South as a paradise for refugees and the North as a place of pervasive malnourishment, forced labor, and political repression. This notion that the refugees fleeing North Vietnam were embarking on a quote-unquote flight toward freedom strengthened the argument that US military presence in Vietnam was necessary for the greater good of the Vietnamese people. Aware that most Vietnamese were illiterate, the USIA also used film as a means to spread their lies. They hired drivers to transport movie projectors in trucks to organize film screenings in villages and even rice paddies for the peasants to absorb this deadly propaganda. They painted a portrait of President Ngo Dinh Diem, the South Vietnamese puppet leader, as someone who worked in the interests of the Vietnamese people. In actuality, President Diem brutalized Vietnamese peasants of all religions and ethnic groups who dared to challenge America's presence in Vietnam. He facilitated mass executions, torture programs, and concentration camps. The majority of South Vietnam hated him because it was clear that he was a part of the US strategy that used Asians to kill other Asians. Most people in the South supported Ho Chi Minh, their beloved leader in the fight against the French and American oppressors. But the films portrayed Diem as a kind figure with roots in the Vietnamese people. On the other hand, they portrayed Ho Chi Minh as an outsider, not a homegrown revolutionary like he was in actuality, but a pawn of the Soviet Union and Russia. Ho Chi Minh was made out to be a foreigner who appeared to be invading Vietnam and stealing the country from the Vietnamese people. This emotional manipulation embedded within the Vietnamese a sense of despair and a longing for the homeland that they lost to the communists. With an annual budget of $132 million by 1959, it is estimated that the motion pictures programs of the USIA reached a total of over 9 million people in 1960. It was said by a USIA officer, Douglas Pike, that at the time it was the biggest motion picture operation in the world. The USIA's psychological warfare served as a tool of military recruitment for the United States, who needed brown and yellow people to fight their war. Their propaganda distorted who the real enemy of the Vietnamese people was and created the atmosphere for brothers to kill their own brothers. This continued into the 1970s when the American policy of Vietnamization armed puppet troops to carry out the strategy of suppressing the Vietnamese anti-US resistance. It's like what Malcolm X said: if you're not careful, the newspapers will have you hating the people who are being oppressed and loving the people who are doing the oppressing. Growing up, we often heard that our families fled Vietnam because the communists executed whoever supported the South Vietnamese government. The Australian journalist Wilfred Burchett proved these accusations wrong. He interviewed the American POWs held captive by the North Vietnamese, who testified that they received fair and adequate treatment for survival. He interviewed Vietnamese peasants who witnessed soldiers from the South Vietnamese Army dressing up in the black uniforms of the National Liberation Army before massacring villages of people to make it look like it was the communists who did it. The Muhammad Speaks newspaper also reported that the majority of people in Vietnam correctly identified the myth of the bloodthirsty revolutionary as a baseless accusation being perpetrated by US intelligence. The American regime attempted to restore its image as a friendly humanitarian government after murdering over 3 million of the people of Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. They did this by facilitating the transfer of refugees to North America. In Operation Baby Lift, which took place as the war was nearing its end, US soldiers were pictured in the American media as gentle protectors, rescuing Vietnamese orphans from the dangerous Vietnam and transporting them to the safe and peaceful land of North America. This PR campaign constructed the Vietnamese refugee as the emblematic victim of communism, as a means to solidify the image of a morally superior America, in contrast to the corrupt and authoritarian government of what was to become the Socialist Republic of Vietnam. It was to show the world that the US war in Vietnam was necessary in order to save the Vietnamese children from their own people. Gerald Ford, the US president in 1975, signed the Indochina Migration and Refugee Act less than a month after Vietnam's liberation. This designated over $400 million toward the transportation, resettlement, and processing of Southeast Asian refugees. Victor Palmieri, the coordinator of refugee affairs, said in 1980, we must consider how our participation in refugee resettlement efforts can further our broader foreign policy objective. Henry Kissinger, the architect of the bombing of Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia, stressed that the media coverage of the transfer of refugees should emphasize the basic humanitarian nature of the US government. Their calculated transfer of refugees served as a justification for the embargo they imposed on Vietnam, which prevented other nations from sending help to what was then one of the poorest countries in the world. They accused the Vietnamese communists of inhumane actions in order to cover up the atrocities that they themselves were committing against the Vietnamese people. We often hear about the hard-working refugee, the brave people who escape their corrupt countries in order to find a better life in America. But it is this constructed image of the resilient and traumatized Vietnamese refugee victim that was created to reinforce the image of the morally corrupt and brutal Vietnamese freedom fighter. But what the refugee-making process also did was separate Vietnamese Americans from the international anti-imperialist struggle by turning them against it. It embedded within the refugees a contempt for the heroes who sacrificed their lives to defeat the powerful United States. They did this by assigning virtue to the voice of the Vietnamese imperialist collaborator and vilifying the Vietnamese revolutionary. Therefore, the refugees have been conditioned to see those who stand up to the US government as an enemy and a threat to his own personal security. This refugee-making process sought to create a force of pro-imperialist foot soldiers within the American population to destroy the bridge between Black and Asian people. Black US soldiers and Black people in America made the most significant contribution toward ending the war out of all Americans. But since war was established by US propaganda as a humanitarian endeavor, it conditions Asian Americans to believe that those who rise up against the US war machine are morally corrupt and inhumane. That's deep. Whether they be in Asia or America. So today's demonization of Black and Asian figures who stood up against the war in Vietnam, figures such as Muhammad Ali, Martin Luther King Jr., the Honorable Elijah Muhammad, Ho Chi Minh, and Vo Nguyen Giap. The attack against these figures is to prevent Blacks and Asians from realizing their common struggle against the war makers of the West. The condemnation of these figures is also a condemnation of the people they represent. The US government separated Vietnamese Americans from the international community by instilling within them a blind obedience to the status quo of US empire. Vietnamese refugees were psychologically broken, separated from their revolutionary heritage, and used as pawns for the continuation of US foreign and domestic policy. I am not trying to put down refugees or the children of refugees. I am asking, why should the refugee identity be the model for who we can strive to become? Because I've come to the realization that many of us have never left those refugee camps. Remember how they described us: passive, helpless, devoid of inner self-propelling force, governed by forces outside of our control. We must ask ourselves, who benefits from us being in this condition? The rulers of this government have robbed you of your proud revolutionary history, which also means that they robbed you of your backbone. They've taught you to look down on where you come from and the people you come from. You have been reduced to an object of their sick desire to keep you in a permanently neutral and disempowered position. And so we have a generation of youth who lack character, who are wandering through life aimlessly, who abuse drugs and alcohol because their fear of facing reality is greater than their belief that they can change reality. They've prevented you from becoming who you're meant to be by making you into what they want you to be. Your creative faculties to mold yourself into something greater than what you are has been destroyed. They've killed your spirit by miseducating you. Our fight against the war agenda of this country is part and parcel with the struggle to save our youth. We have the choice to no longer take part in maintaining our oppressor and to put an end to their positioning, to their poisoning of our minds with the spirit of cynicism and defeat. Let me read that again. We have the choice to no longer take part in the maintaining of our oppressor and to put an end to their poisoning of our minds with the spirit of cynicism and defeat. The world is moving in a new direction. The European powers who long ago divided Africa and Asia, and in their wars used a darker people to conquer another darker people, did not see the day that their empire would come to an end. But the sun is setting on the white man's world. In the words of Martin Luther King Jr., the shirtless and barefoot people are rising up. It is time we determine who our true enemies are on our own terms, and then ask ourselves the question, what side are we on? Many famous Vietnamese American scholars are telling the lie that the Vietnamese revolutionaries were brutal in their very nature, as if to make the argument that they were as brutal as the US military. This is the position of war apologists who work in the interests of the empire. Ho Chi Minh did not invent Agent Orange. Ho Chi Minh did not invent napalm. It was not Ho Chi Minh who turned South Vietnam into a giant whorehouse. It was the US government. Be for real. Men and women living under conditions of genocide have the right to defend themselves against the forces that aim to annihilate them. The vilification of our anti-colonial struggle imposes the limitations of the white world into the mind of a young person and prevents him from rising up to become a changer of his circumstance. Our revolutionary history frees our creative potential and informs us on the future we are capable of bringing into existence. So for the sake of future generations, we must not compromise the truth. We, the children of a lost people, can reclaim our righteous role on this earth only if we break free from the falsehood that has held us captive. Only if we embrace the history of our brave freedom fighters rather than the lies told by those who succumbed to the cruelty of the world. There are people throughout Africa, Asia, and Latin America who admire the Vietnamese people and remember our heroic struggle. We have brothers and sisters in every continent. We can release ourselves from the fear that imprisons us if we are defined not by a shared victimhood, but a shared sense of duty to uplift our fellow humanity. Our true heritage gives us the foundation to begin our transformation into a free people and to become a force for positive change in this society and the world.
All right, thank you, Brendan. With that, we welcome Eddie.
The vision laid out here in our event today has allowed me to understand my heritage, Mexico and Latin America, and the place that our people have in the fight for peace. King defined peace not as the absence of tension, but the presence of justice. Thus, he identified the greatest threats to peace as war, economic exploitation, and racism. Many people in Latin America feel that their countries have failed them because of widespread corruption, laziness, or some moral failing and inferiority of their own people. However, these triple evils are at the root of Latin Americans' problems and are the primary reason why they immigrate to the United States. Latinos across the globe have their lives upended by the absence of peace. Western economic domination overly determines the life of people. Post-Spanish colonialism, the continent became divided with many small countries whose economies are primarily based on exporting a single raw commodity. This is the idea, this is where the common idea of a banana republic comes from. This kind of economy in Latin America is still widespread today. For example, Chile is positioned to mainly export copper. Even in large countries, the West owns their critical resources. For example, I have a cousin who works in a Canadian mine that happens to be in Oaxaca, Mexico. They also prevent countries from producing for internal consumption. This minimizes the jobs that exist, the goods and services people can have, all while making the country dependent on the West. For example, Mexico is the birthplace of corn, and their people have a diet based around it, and yet they have to buy it from the United States to meet their needs instead of growing it all themselves. Jobs primarily exist for producing for Western consumption. These countries may have political independence, but a small clique of trader natives and Western companies run the economy and thus dictate the direction of the country, limiting the lives of the people. Latin America faces nothing less than economic warfare. The people also face violence. For example, Bolivia faced a military coup at the hands of American missionaries and collaborators. This forced the democratically elected President Evo Morales to flee the country because he believed his country's lithium belonged to his people. In Mexico, it is not uncommon to hear of gun battles in the streets and civilian killings. In El Culiacanazo, the Sinaloa cartel took a whole city hostage for the release of a cartel boss's son, El Ovidio Guzman. This military force was ready to burn the city to the ground. Whether it's officially against a government or not, across the continent, war is being waged against the people. Even if you don't see a foreign army's uniform, this war is the bidding of the West. Every country has its bad people, of course, but in these conflicts, you'll find these people these bad people, with arms for the United States, often working with the United States. The goal is to destabilize, morally and spiritually erode, and recede the development of a beautiful people, rendering them less capable of standing up to the West. And this is all racism because the abrupt demise of this continent's civilizations and continual exploitation is racially permissible because these are a darker people. Being kept poor, uneducated, and under danger, and without many options presented, people think, why not come to the United States? If I work hard, if not me, my child will have an opportunity for a good life. It doesn't exactly turn out like that. The United States knows what they're doing to our countries, and they know we're coming. They have a plan. My family's immigration from Mexico to the United States can help illustrate the path laid out for Latinos in this country. My dad and his brothers landed in Southern California, a place already populated by a lot of hardworking Latino immigrants willing to do more for less. They quickly realized they were only ever going to break even, so they went to Chicago. There was a lot of growth, and there was a lot of well-paying construction jobs. As a working man, my dad was able to achieve stability, buy a home, and basically live the American dream. And the same is true of my uncles as well, who came with him, but not of this generation. Well-paid construction jobs are now few and far in between because as immigrants, they are actually put at odds with their children's future. The ruling class planned for immigrants to come from and arrive to precarious circumstances, allowing employers to take advantage of them and lower the floor for everyone. Sometimes backward movement happens step by step as more immigrants arrive. Sometimes this regression comes crashing down on people's lives. Regardless, the financial gains immigrants leave their home behind for are often short-term at best. This highlights the primary role the ruling class has for Latino immigrants. They are meant to undercut labor. Americans have fought for rights in the workplace, something simple like an 8-hour working day, safe working conditions, no child labor. And Black America especially has fought for these advances. The ruling class has pitted these workers against one another, giving white workers less than they deserve if it means they have more than Black people, even if it's just the wage of whiteness, knowing you're white. In order to undermine the progress of Black and white unity, this united front is replaced by Latino workers who don't understand what will happen to them, their kids, and their peers if they accept less wages and working rights and just worse conditions. These groups feel their interests are at the expense of one another and end up fighting amongst themselves for crumbs. Impoverishing Latin America has made people poor in the United States. Our destinies are intertwined, and so enriching one of us can enrich all of us. Further in this story, my cousin's upbringings further illustrate this country has for its immigrant children. Latinos often think the least of Black people because they are in a dejected state in this country despite having citizenship. This leaves them ill-prepared. The concerted effort this ruling class has taken to degrade Black people spills over to them as well. With these low wages, they don't live in the best areas all the time. And so the drugs that were passing through their home country, their destination are here in those neighborhoods. The guns that the United States put in their home country to destabilize them are put in those neighborhoods as well. And their education fails them, not just because they receive limited substandard base reading, writing, and math skills. The history they receive lowers their self-worth. Removed from your ancestral heritage and given a false American history, you are left with no positive examples to look toward for the kind of person that you want to be, the values and the principles you want to embody. The human education they receive in and out of the classroom is the most condemning. Their kids were not raised in a humble village where your neighbors felt like your family, where you can open up your arms to a stranger instead of treading cautiously with distrust like you have to feel out here. Where you can see people that look like you holding their head up high, living tall and proud, and finding joy in simple living of life. My aunts and uncles might think that it's progress because they didn't go to high school, but their kids are. But this education has failed to forge the same loving, generous spirit. Instead, the youth don't value their lives and can't conceive a worthwhile future for themselves. They're mad at the world and may retreat inward, like a lot of young men out here who play video games all day, stunted as boys. Or they might live recklessly, damaging their lives and the lives of those around them, as someone else takes responsibility for these mistakes. All this is happening while they're to the Latino immigrant youth, while their parents are at home, while their parents are working a lot of jobs, oblivious to what is happening, and with little time to interject and dedicate themselves to their children's development. And then one day they think to themselves, why is my kid skipping class? Why is he drinking and smoking? Why is my teenage daughter pregnant? Where's the father? Why is my son a father and he doesn't have a job? Do they bear some responsibility? Yes. And yet I can't accept that my people are simply inferior. This society has purposely failed them. Latinos were not able to simply leave degradation behind and find peace elsewhere. Their destinies were once more inseparable from America's and the rest of the world. And so we are still left with this burning question: what should we do for our people in all the Americas? The broad consensus among young Latinos is to fight for DACA and the DREAM Act in exchange for loyalty to the Democratic Party. DACA stands for Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals, and it essentially gives undocumented immigrants that came here as the chance to apply for undocumented immigrants that came here as children, a chance to apply for a driver's license and a work permit for 2 years. It's short protection from deportation, subject to renewal, and has no path to citizenship. The DREAM Act stands for Development, Relief, and Education for Alien Minors, and it allows the best behaved immigrants who came here as children a path toward citizenship if they go to college and then either work or join the military. This legislation at most cultivates a small elite dedicated to the ruling class and to advancing themselves. They tell the story, I came from a poor, corrupt place, so I deserve to be here. And I even deserve some privileges to make up for it. The United States is painted as a hero that gave them an opportunity. This provides the ruling class with a moral shield to pursue its perverse interests at home and abroad. These crumbs do not address why people feel compelled to come here in the first place. All while giving the war agenda free rein to make things worse for their brothers and sisters where they came from. These laws do not speak to the generation they are inevitably increasing for themselves and their brothers and sisters right here. This struggle is currently conceived transactionally. I'll sidetrack myself a little bit to support your singular issue if it means you show up when I try to push mine. Without a sense of our mutual destinies, this is bound to happen and is especially true of the immigration movement. What makes this worse is that upholding and expanding this legislation is not only seen as the highest expression of political consciousness, it's also heralded as a place for principled unity with Asians in America. We are corralled together for a detrimental cause and are reinforced down this wrong path because it must be right if another racial group is also committed. There is a higher striving We can join our brothers in fulfilling the ideals of the Asian anti-colonial struggles. The United States dropped 3 times more bombs on Korea and Vietnam, each during those wars, than they did on the entirety of Europe in World War II. These struggles showed us that united, man can triumph over machine, that a moral force can overcome a military force. In Korea, ordinary people decided the direction of their lives and their country through a governance that was natural to their life worlds. They had farmers' associations, unions of varying kinds, neighborhood associations. Through these, you could elect someone that you knew and trusted, that understood and often shared your experience, who was invested in improving your country and well-being. Koreans found a way to enact their will and build up their battered nation. Why not us? We also have a home in the Black freedom struggle of America. Black people were forced to live like animals for centuries, and yet slaves were able to turn the tide during the Civil War, liberate themselves from bondage, and raise themselves up to men during Reconstruction. The Southern plantation viability was only in sustaining plantation owners. It was inefficient, wasteful, and obviously neglected the slaves working it. Working whites were also left destitute as the South was organized around the Black worker as the primary producer. The freedmen redistributed land, transforming the Southern economy so that a man could be self-sustaining, provide for his family, and build up his tattered country that he just finished fighting for. They drafted state constitutions and through elections controlled former slave states like South Carolina. Freedmen wholly dedicated themselves to founding the public school in the South. All facets of Black America gave themselves to this cause. Those who had the least sacrificed the little money they had just made since becoming free and offered their labor to physically build it. And no one was left out. No one was too old to get educated. All were welcome to better themselves so that they'd be more equipped to serve their people and ensure the next generation. Poor whites were also not educated in the South, and so this sacrifice was made for all. We should seek to fulfill the high ideals of democracy, continuing the work of the Black proletariat in this new context. If we refuse war in all forms, we remove the obstacle to joining arms with each other in a world democracy, so that in this country and internationally, we can develop ourselves towards mutual elevation. As Latinos, we must also look towards ourselves for our path forward. We must discover the distinct character our struggle has taken and the fundamental contributions to human uplift. It can feel like we're on a downward spiral. Our present and our ancestral home is being physically destroyed and morally adulterated. But we have something to hold on to. We have fought for the human family. That progress must be upheld. We must inherit this and make it our own. Latin America has already advanced this cause. Cubans have fought to bring forth the natural expression of democracy in their country through their literacy campaign. After overthrowing the Batista dictatorship and making an enemy of the United States, this island, 90 miles from Florida, decided their priority was to eradicate illiteracy. Young people went to the most rural parts of the country to teach people how to read and write. Yet the youth learned more than they taught. By bringing all of their people together, the country could decide what the new Cuba was going to be, what freedom meant for them. Cuba has continually contributed to world democracy. Their free medical program is available to young people from around the world. They will educate you if you wish to live a life in service to your people. Despite facing economic warfare, their people volunteer themselves to provide medical services across the continent. Cubans have so little, yet their citizens offer their lives to fight imperialism in Angola because they knew that fight was theirs. What directly affects one indirectly affects all of us. Allowing apartheid in South Africa to consume another nation will only strengthen Western empire to turn its talons on us. And even if they weren't threatened, the immiseration of the Angolans will diminish us all. A free Cuba has enriched all of us, and so a free Angola would do the same. America has people from all corners of this earth. Here we can learn to live amongst each other as brothers and sisters, synthesizing these guiding truths from our forefathers and from a broader conception of struggle. The way we live together here can bring about the birth of a new world order. I have so much to uncover as I strive to bring Latin America's contribution to the forefront and invite all of you to continue to join us in our search for our path forward.
Thank you, Eddie. With that, I invite Eunnuri up.
In the last few years, the rise of Asia has largely only been acknowledged by the West in a positive sense through the recognition of modern South Korean culture, also known as the K-wave, consisting of Korean pop music, dramas, film, beauty, and other consumer exports. This growing interest in South Korea and its success in top charts, awards, and records is considered a great achievement. Okay. Just worried about time. Many young Asians in the West have rooted for South Korea's growing cultural stature, seeing it as a victory in a society where growing up, you're told that your Asian background is something to be ashamed of, and that as such, you should aspire to lose your heritage and your history and assimilate into the white way of life. While this rise of South Korean culture is an interesting development, I think we have to question the assumption that it's inherently positive and progressive, and evaluate it first in its history and current world developments as a calculated move with geopolitical implications, and secondly, in terms of its actual cultural and moral content, what it reflects about society and what it encourages in us young people whose identities are most shaped by it, where it stands in regards to the legacy of the anti-colonial struggle that Koreans already have to look to for progress, peace, and unity. We first need to understand the forces and context promoting this culture because they're strategic, not spontaneous. We know Korea has long been geopolitically significant, subjected to foreign intervention and occupation. What's less discussed is how for so long, the single wish of the Korean people has been for the unity and integrity of the peninsula and its people, and that America has fought against the interests of the Korean people. This goes against what we're taught as young people in America, which is that Americans fought selflessly in the Korean War to save the Korean people from the communists, that we likewise bombed Vietnam, Afghanistan, Syria, sanctioned North Korea and Cuba, and toppled countless governments across the world for freedom. We're told to believe, despite all evidence, that America has unshakable moral authority, so we're justified and even mandated to go to war as the sole protector of democracy. This is the cover for the war agenda, spread worldwide by countless Hollywood movies, but it's not the truth, and many people in this country have long known it. Muhammad Ali said in 1967 when he was drafted into the Vietnam War, quote, "I'm not going 10,000 miles from home to help murder and burn another poor nation, simply to continue the domination of white slave masters of the darker people the world over. The real enemy of my people is here. I will not disgrace my religion, my people, or myself by becoming a tool to enslave those who are fighting for their own justice, freedom, and equality. These wars are made for the ruling class's profit and only paid for by the poor. We have to remember it was Black America which stood most firmly against interference in Korea. It was Black America's refusal and opposition which turned the tide towards the end of conflict in Vietnam, and that it was Black America, with its history of fighting for freedom from slavery, for civil rights, and people's democracy in America, that we as Asians ought to trust. When James Baldwin wrote, "No Black man in chains in his own country, and watching the many deaths occurring around him every day, believes for a moment that America cares anything at all about the freedom of Asia, we have all the reason to believe him." We should know the ruling class cares nothing for the freedom of Asia because Korean villages were bombed to ashes many times over by the United States, and our families driven underground, slaughtered, scattered, and still separated to this day. The United States refuses to sign an end-of-war agreement using the unresolved conflict that they drag out as justification for military bases, troops, and missile defense systems on the peninsula, which only creates more tension. Generations of Koreans are growing up only knowing partition, and America stands between the North and the South, blocking our continued dream of peace and reunification. South Korea, as such, plays an important strategic role in the American war agenda, geopolitically as well as ideologically and culturally. Every history of the Korean War tells us the state of South Korea would not exist if not for the American military. From its inception, the South has been a neo-colony, forcibly created by the United States, with puppets like Syngman Rhee and collaborators installed by Americans simply replacing the Japanese imperial apparatus. Even after the democratization movement to overthrow the military dictatorships backed by the United States, the South has continued to firmly align itself with America in an unequal relationship, even sending South Korean troops on behalf of America in Vietnam to kill other Asian peoples and suppress the Vietnamese struggle for freedom. When American media lifts up South Korea or Taiwan as a rare, open, modern, democratic, and free Asian country, contrasting it heavy-handedly to the other supposedly despotic, authoritarian, backwards, and inhuman regimes like China or North Korea, it lies about the reality of both sides. The American ruling class's position and attitude towards South Korea is, and has always been, to protect the interests of the American dominant world order, not for democracy or for the benefit of the people in the South. We have to expose and fight against this malicious war agenda, which preys on the pain and suffering of the people and manipulates it towards its own ends. The South Korean example of modern democracy is held up to morally justify the superiority of the Western way of life. This is the ideology of white supremacy wearing a different face, pitting Asians against Asians. In Asia, the war agenda has forced Koreans to fight one another against the people of Vietnam and puts them against China today. In America, it pits Asians against the Black people who have been their strongest and most principled allies. The war agenda encourages Asians to abandon their legitimate and proud history, culture, and heritage of the anti-colonial struggle, which provides a foundation for unity and peace. White supremacy influences them to turn their backs on their brothers in Asia and in America, and instead ally themselves more closely with white people to peddle the lie of the success of American democracy. This agenda for war works not just by military force and brute coercion, but also in more subtle and insidious ways, through culture which shapes people's, especially young people's, sense of morality, psychology, and even their sense of possibility. While culture is often reduced to popular entertainment or elevated to high art where your criticism should be limited to the aesthetic or the theoretical, culture is also inherently an ideological, moral, and political force. A cultural foundation is necessary to encourage or to enable war, to first make people see war as a possibility and then as an inevitability. The culture of our war society recruits and motivates those under its influence to follow its bidding without requiring coercion or even consciousness of the forces and larger interests at play. Seeing how South Korea fits into the American agenda for Asia, as well as where Asian Americans fit in America's racial landscape today, we have to ask, what kind of culture is being produced in the South that chosenly gets popularized in the West? And how does its portrayal of humanity influence people? There is, I think, a new trend towards a genre which normalizes violence, disunity, and nihilism, especially in film and television. Pieces like Parasite and Squid Game have been some of the biggest hits of the last few years, and there have been many think pieces and reviews praising this gritty, anti-capitalist, and dystopic cultural phenomena as a groundbreaking achievement of art. Parasite was the first Korean film to win the Palme d'Or, the first non-English language film to win the Academy Award for Best Picture, and only the third film ever to win both. Through Netflix especially, K-dramas have been given a greater budget, platform, and Western audience. Netflix spent $500 million on Korean content in 2021 and contributed $4.7 billion in socioeconomic impact to Korean industries in that same year. An interesting comparison is to the annual military expenditure of North Korea, which people make a lot about, but which was just $3.6 billion a year. Netflix is an example of the increasingly inseparable cultural relationship between South Korea and the United States. Squid Game, a fictional survival show created specifically for Netflix because no Korean broadcasting channel would support it, became Netflix's most watched series ever. In this series, 456 players, all in deep debt, risk their lives to play children's games, dying if they lose, as well as killing one another along the way for the chance to win a multi-million-dollar prize. All this is coordinated purely for the entertainment of a masked ruling class. These two examples of Parasite and Squid Game were the most notable, and I think have pioneered this violent, nihilistic, but supposedly anti-capitalist trope into a genre. But now there are constant additions, like #Alive and All of Us Are Dead, which is the most recent Korean hit about a zombie outbreak at a high school that causes society to fall into chaos and martial law, turning against itself. These shows are increasingly violent and in ways that are socially abnormal. But according to Netflix, people across the world have spent a collective 2.1 billion hours watching Squid Game. That's 2.1 billion hours of a narrative which normalizes Asians killing other Asians and treating one another in the most barbaric, violent, and cruel ways. Despite the disclaimer of being fiction, it forces you to consider it a possibility. And throughout the course of the show, murder becomes normalized to something that you expect. With time, like the players, you become numb and accepting. Instead of thinking about what those deaths actually mean, instead you find it tolerable, and then even entertaining, relating exactly to the perspective of the ruling class. This isn't right. The message, which is not profound, is that everyday people are pitted mercilessly against one another to compete, while the ruling class remains largely hidden, protected, and comfortable, facing only minor consequences that are disproportionate to their sins. The moral lesson, if there is one, is that the world is unfair, but crucially, that there's also no path of struggle to make it better. The poor and oppressed have the odds stacked against them and are simply doomed to lose, so they might as well give up. Transforming the system is impossible, so success can only mean joining the winning side, which is the ruling class. Parasite and Squid Game also both imply that lying, cheating, stealing, and murdering for survival, as well as for personal gain, is morally permissible and perhaps even inevitable within the existing system. People say these films and shows have a vaguely anti-capitalist message critiquing the system, but that negative message is also nihilistic and deeply anti-social. It implies that although regrettably the working class may be the primary victim suffering the most, that in the end, working class morality and ruling class morality are both equally open to corruption, that all human beings can be pushed to such a limit that they come to accept moral depravity. In this genre, there is no productive consciousness or spirit, no possibility of class solidarity or broader unity, and thus there's no hope. According to this genre, the biggest enemy and obstacle of Koreans today are no longer the imperialists, but the people themselves and their powerlessness. This genre's nihilistic outlook on the world and the moral flippancy it encourages in young people disrespects and contradicts the history, sacrifices, and the ongoing nature of the anti-colonial and anti-imperialist struggle in Korea and in the world. That heritage is not fully given to us, but the culture of the struggle was one in which the moral choices and the stakes were clearly defined. Our heroes were not trained and constructed celebrities, but were instead ordinary people like Yu Gwan-sun and Kim Il-sung, who firmly said no to colonial collaboration, even in the face of torture or death. They fought against Japanese and imperialism, refusing to give up or compromise. They refused to be dehumanized or morally degraded. Their spirit could not be defeated. In our study of the Korean War and the anti-colonial struggle, we saw that this culture brought out and developed qualities of courage, discipline, compassion, and selflessness in the people, so that when the greatest military force on earth rained down enough bombs to burn down every North Korean town, the people still refused to give up, moving underground and farming and rebuilding at night. Journalist Wilfred Burchett returned to Korea in 1967, coming directly from war reporting in Vietnam to meet with Premier Kim Il-sung. This trip resulted in the book Again Korea. Seeing North Korea's post-war reconstruction, Burchett was reminded of a quote by Ho Chi Minh, which was posted on city walls in North Vietnam. It said, "The war may last 5, 10, 20, or more years. Hanoi and Haiphong, as well as a certain number of other towns and enterprises, may be destroyed, but the Vietnamese people will never allow themselves to be intimidated. Nothing is more precious than liberty and independence." After the victory, our people will rebuild the country better and will endow it with bigger and more beautiful contributions. Burchett wrote that everything in North Korea, 13 years after the war, confirms this possibility. Pyongyang was unrecognizable from the ruins of war, and even the napalm-blackened mountains turned green again. Burchett concludes Again Korea writing, quote, "You can bomb the Vietnamese and Korean people underground, but you cannot bomb them back into the Stone Age. You cannot bomb out of existence those solid technical, intellectual, and moral qualities they have acquired during the years of building and living under socialism. What Stone Age moralists such as Curtis LeMay would like to bomb out of existence is indestructible. If what has been built up in North Korea is destroyed again, the abundant, fruitful orchard will grow faster than ever again." This is our true heritage. The moral qualities, selflessness, unbreakable unity, and indomitable spirit of the anti-colonial and anti-imperialist struggle, which is found in Korea and throughout the world. It is this heritage, culture, and pride defended by countries like North Korea today that have to be so vehemently attacked, hidden, and suppressed by the American ruling class. Because the spirit cannot be broken, it has to be replaced with the nihilism, negativity, and mindless consumerism offered to us today through the K-pop and Netflix dramas produced in the South. It has to be diluted by turning the people against one another and obscuring the true enemy. Peace and democracy are eternal ideas that belong to all people, reflecting the whole of humanity's strivings. What we have to decide now is which culture and which values we should attack or take up to do right by our proud heritage and win the peace and democracy that's needed for humanity today. Thank you.
Thank you to all three panelists. Given time constraints, we'll move forward with the cultural performances. But if anyone has questions, please save them for after the event when you reach out to each individual. Thank you so much.